The first sound was not thunder, though it carried the weight of worlds dying. It was a tearing, a slow and merciless rending of the veil between one existence and another. Across the skies of a doomed imperial battlefield, the wound widened like the lash of an unseen god, spilling a violet radiance that had no right to exist in the Imperium. Soldiers froze mid-charge, bolters raised, prayers half-spoken. Even the corrupted warriors of chaos halted their advance, gazes lifting toward the heavens as if witnessing the birth of a new omen. From within that wound came a silhouette. Sasuke Uchiha fell like a fragment of night torn from another sky, his cloak whipping violently around him as gravity reclaimed him. He descended through the shimmering edges of the rift, showering and flaring with instinctive menace, as if even his eyes strained to decipher the impossible. Chakra stormed through his veins, wild and reactive, as if unsure whether it should defend him from the warp or devour it. His feet struck cracked stone, sending a shockwave of dust rolling across corpses and shattered armor. The air tasted of metal and old incense, the scent clinging to the ruins of a cathedral that had once been a monument to the emperor. Now only blackened pillars remained, each marked by the scorching of heretical sorcery and the clawing fingers of demons. Sasuke's gaze rose to the sky he had fallen from, an unfamiliar sun, a dying haze, and above it the rift slowly sealing as though ashamed of what it had delivered. He was alone, but far from unnoticed. Bolters clicked into readiness. The first voices he heard were not welcome ones, harsh, ritualistic, brimming with suspicion carved from centuries of war. Mutant, witch, psyker. He did not understand the words, but he recognized intent. A squad of Imperial guardsmen encircled him, armor cracked and filthy, yet still bearing the two-headed Aquila with reverent desperation. Their fear stank stronger than the smoke drifting from ruined sanctuaries. Sasuke stepped back, hand hovering near his sword hilt. The world around him was foreign, hostile, hollowed of familiar life. His chakra sensed everywhere a heavy pressure, as though the very air had been wounded long before he arrived. One soldier aimed too quickly. Sasuke vanished before the man could exhale. A blur of motion, a whisper of displaced dust. Then the Uchiha stood behind them, eyes spinning in silent warning. The guardsman stumbled, shaken not only by his speed, but by something deeper, something neither technology nor faith had prepared them to comprehend. This place is wrong. The thought pressed into his skull, carried on the uneasy pulse of the rift still echoing within him. Sasuke scanned the desolation, his gaze fixing on the half-collapsed cathedral some distance away. Its stained glass windows, those few still intact, depicted a golden figure on a throne of flame. Worship, devotion, rule through unquestioned authority. He knew such symbolism too well. His world had its own gods and martyrs of ambition, but this figure, this emperor, radiated through the images with something unsettlingly real. A tremor passed through the ground, followed by a guttural bellow that rolled across the ruins like a plague wind. The Chaos Marines stepped into view as if the shadows themselves birthed them. Rot-choked armor, diseased metal dripping with filth that hissed when it touched the stone. Their presence was an offense to life itself. Even Sasuke felt the air recoil. The guardsmen broke ranks immediately. Some retreated to defensive positions. Others muttered frantic litanies, begging the emperor for deliverance. Sasuke's instincts sharpened. Whatever these towering, corrupted warriors were, their malice was a presence of its own, a pressure that gnawed at the boundaries of his chakra. They moved with the confidence of executioners walking toward the condemned. One lifted a rust-covered blade and pointed it directly at him. "New flesh," the Marine growled, his voice rotting from within. "And unclaimed. The warp favors us today." Sasuke's brows narrowed. He did not know the meaning behind their words, but he recognized the hunger in their tone. Prey. They saw him as prey, not a threat, not an equal, but a resource, a tool, an offering. The implication churned something cold beneath his ribs. Lightning crackled faintly around his fingers, but the air changed before he could act. A whisper, barely audible, coiled inside his skull. Not a voice from outside, but one that slipped directly into the marrow of his mind, bypassing all defenses. "We see you, wandering child." Sasuke froze. "We see your eyes. We see your hunger. We see the storm twisting inside your soul." His Sharingan flared instinctively, scanning for the source, but there was nothing. Only flickering shadows and the stench of corrupted armor. The whisper continued, velvet soft and malign. "The warp is watching." He forced the voice away, severing its tendrils with pure force of will. A normal mind would have broken. Sasuke remained standing, though the taste of metal filled his mouth. The Chaos Marines advanced. The guardsmen scattered, and Sasuke, for the first time since arriving, understood the scale of this world. Not through its armies or its ruins, but through the presence pressing against the edges of his consciousness. This place is not governed by human war alone. It is governed by something deeper, something alive. A bolt of disease fire erupted from a Marine's weapon, screaming through the air with all the fury of damned souls. Sasuke moved, leaving only a ghost of himself behind as the blast tore a crater into the stone. He reappeared above them, lightning flooding his palm, chakra burning a bright, defiant blue against a world drowned in grey and blood. But as he prepared to strike, the whisper returned, quieter this time, yet impossibly close. "Try, if you wish. The warp enjoys watching mortals struggle." Sasuke's jaw tightened. Whatever this realm was, it had already acknowledged him, and it was waiting. The roar of corrupted bolters rose again, and the first true battle for Sasuke's survival in this forsaken universe began. The blast shook the ruins before the echoes of the first had even faded, showering the cracked cathedral stones with dust and scorched fragments of ancient iconography. Sasuke dropped from the air with calculated precision, slipping between bolts of corrupted fire that carved molten trails across the ground. The Chaos Marines advanced without haste, their steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the inevitability of their triumph. Each movement radiated a grotesque confidence, the assurance of warriors who had long since forgotten mortality. Sasuke drove forward. Lightning surged along his hand, the glow cold and concentrated as he plunged straight into the closest Marine. His strike hit with thunderous force, the Chidori screeching as it collided with armor forged in the darkest forges of the Eye of Terror. Sparks exploded outward, casting frantic illumination across the ruins. The blow did not pierce through as easily as his enemies back home, but it struck hard enough to stagger the towering warrior and tear a molten wound across his corrupted breastplate. The Marine bellowed in rage. The others moved instantly, raising their weapons in a storm of diseased fire. Sasuke's body blurred as he twisted away, his cloak whipping behind him like torn shadows. The stench of burning ozone mixed with the foul gases bleeding from the Marine's weapons, creating a suffocating haze that clung to his lungs with every breath. He swept his gaze across the environment. Devastation stretched in every direction. Blackened towers carved with ancient imperial symbols jutted from the ground, like the ribs of some colossal dead beast. The sky, sickly and bruised, loomed heavy with drifting ash. Fires crawled across broken chapels and shattered temples, their flames feeding on relics once revered by countless worshippers. The air trembled with a spiritual weight, a pressure that pushed relentlessly against Sasuke's senses. This world is dying. Not metaphorically, not slowly. It was a death in motion, visible, audible, and drenched in despair. The guardsmen who had first confronted him were scattering across the battlefield, caught between the onslaught of the corrupted legionaries and the sudden appearance of the mysterious warrior whose powers they did not understand. Some fled entirely, dissolving into the haze. Others dared to take position behind ruins, shouting litanies and firing sporadically at the advancing enemy. Their courage was fragile, held together not by hope, but by the crumbling remnants of duty. Sasuke leapt backward as a bolter round detonated at his feet, sending a plume of writhing green fire into the sky. The explosion radiated with a wrongness his chakra instantly rejected. He felt the air itself recoil, as if the flames were alive, gnawing at the edges of reality. Another whisper pushed into his mind, thinner this time, yet unmistakably deliberate. You do not belong here, and yet you fit. He stiffened, jaw clenching. The whisper was neither hallucination nor psychic attack. It was something woven into the very fabric of this realm, something watching him, evaluating him, patiently marking every action. He forced it aside again, focusing instead on the Marines regrouping for another strike. The wounded one rose to his full height, armor dripping molten slag. You bleed light, the Marine snarled, voice grinding like rusted gears. We will carve it out of you. Sasuke formed a single seal. Fire erupted from his mouth in a blazing arc, sweeping across the advancing heretics. The flames roared as they met the corrupted armor, forcing the Marines into a defensive stagger. Yet, even engulfed, they advanced through the inferno, their silhouettes monstrous and unwavering. Their resilience was unnatural. It defied both chakra and logic. Sasuke's hand tightened around his sword hilt. The world here operated under different rules, different laws. Strength and willpower existed, but something colder shaped the fates of men and monsters alike. He moved again, faster this time. His blade flashed with a clean, cold gleam as he slashed across a Marine's exposed joint, slicing through corrupted muscle and sparking a howl of rage. The Marine retaliated with a sweeping strike of his plague-ridden blade, its edge dripping with fumes that whispered promises of slow death. Sasuke bent beneath the swing, the blade passing inches above his head, then pivoted to drive his heel into the Marine's knee with enough force to crack bone. The warrior toppled with a shuddering crash, shaking the ruined ground. But there were too many. The Marines formed a tightening circle, their weapons glowing with sickly power. Their confidence grew with each step they closed. They believed themselves inevitable. They believed him trapped. Sasuke felt the pressure of the battlefield closing in, the weight of this world's despair sinking into his bloodstream like venom. Every ruin whispered a story of cleansing flame. Every fallen soldier breathed a plea that had gone unanswered. He felt the truth of this place, an empire built on suffering, a universe chained to endless war. As another Marine prepared to fire, a tremor split through the cathedral ruins. The ground quaked violently, stones tumbling from shattered walls as a deafening roar tore across the sky. Not from the Marines, not from any mortal throat, from the heavens above. Sasuke's eyes rose instinctively. The clouds were splitting apart, no, being parted, as a massive vessel descended, its hull carved with imperial sigils that glowed like embers in the twilight. A fortress ship, colossal and merciless, casting its shadow across the battlefield. The Marines cursed, their formation broke, and the guardsmen, seeing the descending warship, fell to their knees in frantic praise. Sasuke did not move. The whispers in his mind changed tone, curling like smoke around a candle flame. Now they come for you. Searchlights from the descending craft pierced the battlefield, locking onto Sasuke with unerring precision. That single beam, cold and blinding, marked him, not as a savior, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely, a threat. The Marines turned away, retreating into the haze, as if unwilling to be caught in the path of the new arrival. Their final glances toward Sasuke held a mixture of hatred and anticipation, as though they expected the Imperium to finish the work they had begun. The beam tightened. Engines roared overhead, and Sasuke understood, with a calm colder than the storm inside him, that whatever ruled this world had just set its gaze upon him. The Imperium had arrived, and they were coming to claim him. The searchlights tightened around him until the ruins were washed in a harsh white glare, erasing all shadow from the cracked stones beneath his feet. The roar of the descending warship thundered through the atmosphere, scattering ash and smoke in spiraling patterns that clawed at the sky. Sasuke felt the intensity of that beam like an accusation, a cold weight pressing against his skin, as if the Imperium itself sought to peel apart the layers of his existence. For a moment, even the whispers of the warp fell silent, as though waiting to see how the newest actor in this dark world would be judged. The ship lowered with ponderous inevitability, its hull as vast as a mountain, carved with centuries of iconography, saints with burning eyes, warriors clad in iron faith, and the looming visage of the Emperor watching from a throne of flame. As the engines dimmed, a final gust of wind swept across the battlefield, forcing the remaining guardsmen to the ground. Their voices rose in fervent prayer, though their words trembled with exhaustion and disbelief. Sasuke did not kneel. His eyes narrowed as a series of clanking mechanisms echoed through the ruins. A long boarding ramp extended from the belly of the vessel, its metal surface scorched from countless deployments. The ramp struck the earth with a resounding clang that reverberated through the cathedral's bones. A thin mist of displaced dust curled around its edges like spectral fingers. Footsteps followed, heavy, rhythmic, methodical. Not the clumsy shuffling of terrified soldiers, nor the corrupted stride of the Chaos Marines who had retreated into the haze. These steps carried purpose, authority, judgment sharpened to a blade. From the ramp emerged figures clad in robes of black and crimson, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks, etched with the sigil of the Inquisition. Their movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as they fanned out across the ruins with weapons trained steadily on Sasuke. Behind them marched a retinue of Skitari, their mechanical forms clattering with gears and pistons as red ocular lenses scanned him with cold, predatory logic. Further back, a towering silhouette stepped into view, an armored giant bearing a purity seal-ridden power fist and the unmistakable icon of the Inquisition engraved across his chestplate. Inquisitor Hulbrecht. The whispers in Sasuke's mind flickered like sparks, circling him with sudden intensity. Be careful, they are afraid of what they do not command. Sasuke kept his gaze fixed on the descending group. Their movements revealed something about their world, an unbreakable hierarchy forged through fear and obedience. They advanced as though confronting a demon, not a man. Their weapons hummed with caged fury, lumens glowing along their barrels. In the name of the God Emperor of mankind, Halbrecht's voice boomed across the ruins, amplified by the vox grill of his helm. You will remain motionless. Sasuke did not react. He watched, posture still, sensing the restless shift in the air. Chakra coiled within him with a predator's patience. The world smelled of ozone, burning incense, and something else, something foul that seeped through the cracks of reality. The warp. Its presence lingered everywhere, as if woven into the stones themselves. Halbrecht stepped forward, each thunderous footfall vibrating the ground. Identify yourself, he commanded, his tone carved with centuries of unquestioned authority. You wield power unbecoming of a mortal. Speak. The guardsmen turned their eyes towards Sasuke, desperate to see whether he would comply or ignite another storm that would drown them all. But Sasuke remained silent, his Sharingan glimmering faintly as he studied the Inquisitor. Power radiated from the man, not chakra, not ki, but an absolute conviction that he stood as executioner of anything deemed unclean. Halbrecht's gauntlet clenched. So be it. 3 Skitarii raised their weapons, targeting arrays locking onto him with a soft whine. The whisper returned, sharper this time. They fear what you are, and what you could become. Sasuke's fingers twitched instinctively, lightning threatening to crackle into existence, but he suppressed it. These people did not understand him. Attacking now would bury him beneath an avalanche of enemies he could not yet measure. Before further commands could be issued, a ripple passed through the air, soft at first, then violent. The ground trembled as an unnatural cold washed across the ruins, snuffing out the warmth of the warship's engines. Halbrecht spun around, Vox barking orders. But the source of the disturbance was not physical. It was not even visible. It was inside Sasuke's skull. A pressure pushed against his thoughts, prying fingers clawing for entry. The warp surged like a tidal wave, flooding the battlefield with psychic residue so thick the guardsmen collapsed, clutching their heads. The Skitari's mechanical limbs spasmed, their neural pathways flickering with interference. Even the Inquisitor staggered, his armor groaning under the strain of the psychic assault. Sasuke gasped as the pressure intensified. His Sharingan spun wildly as he fought to hold his mind intact. Shapes flickered in the corners of his vision, formless, shifting, malicious. They whispered in languages older than stars. Shadows pressed against the edges of thought, begging entrance, promising power, demanding surrender. He fell to one knee, palms bracing against cracked stone. The warp pressed harder. Fragments of memories not his own swarmed inside his mind. Planets consumed by plague, demons howling praise to monstrous gods, lives extinguished like candles snuffed by a careless hand. He tasted blood, he tasted fear, he tasted eternity, and then something inside him flared. His Rinnegan ignited. A shockwave of invisible force rolled outward from his body, scattering dust and psychic residue alike. The whispers recoiled, but not in fear, in interest, in curiosity, as if the warp itself had discovered an unexpected variable, a foreign soul whose eyes mirrored eternity too closely. Halbrecht lifted his head, staring at Sasuke with a mixture of dread and fascination. A psyker, he breathed, almost reverently. No, something beyond a psyker. Sasuke rose slowly, breath steadying, the last tendrils of warp presence curling away from him. But the minds watching him did not leave. They lingered, they waited, and Sasuke, staring into the faint shimmer of unreality gathering at the edge of vision, understood a terrible truth. The warp was not simply aware of him. It was calling him. The silence that followed the psychic tremor was not peace but suspension, a breath held by a dying world. Dust drifted in slow spirals, illuminated by the searchlight still fixed upon Sasuke, its beam trembling as the warship stabilizers struggled to compensate for the lingering distortion in the air. The guardsmen remained collapsed where they had fallen, murmuring prayers like frightened children, their voices thin against the raw quiet. Even the Skitarii, normally unshakable in their mechanized obedience, twitched with residual interference, their targeting arrays sputtering as they recalibrated. Inquisitor Halbrecht alone forced himself upright with sheer iron-willed resolve. His armor creaked as he straightened, red lenses narrowing in cold appraisal as he gazed upon Sasuke, as though seeing him for the first time. The Uchiha's Rinnegan still pulsed faintly, each throb resonating with echoes of the warp's interest. The psychic flare had lasted only seconds, yet Halbrecht understood consequences measured not in moments, but in entire campaigns of faith and annihilation. "Restrain him," the Inquisitor commanded. The order did not echo. It detonated. The nearest acolytes snapped into motion, rifles raised, stance firm despite the lingering psychic paralysis. Sasuke watched them advance, with the calm stillness of a blade resting on its edge. Their eyes held no hatred, only the unyielding conviction of servants executing doctrine older than their bloodlines. They believed themselves righteous. They believed he was a threat ordained for purging. Sasuke shifted his stance, subtle, nearly imperceptible. The air tightened around him, chakra rising like a silent storm. Halbrecht registered the movement instantly and raised a gauntleted hand. "Do not provoke him. Observe." The acolytes slowed, but did not stop. Their weapons remained trained on Sasuke with unwavering discipline. The Imperium moved with a frightening unity, each individual a fragment of a vast machine built to smother anything unknown, anything unlicensed by their gods and doctrines. Halbrecht approached with steady steps. The ground trembled beneath each impact of his armored boots, but Sasuke did not retreat. Their gazes met, one eye swirling with cosmic hunger, the other hidden behind metal and faith. "You carry power that reeks of the Imperium," Halbrecht said, voice colder than the ash-choked wind. "It stains the air around you. It agitates the warp itself. You are not a mere psyker." Sasuke's face remained unreadable. He neither confirmed nor denied. He did not understand their definitions, their rigid labels, their obsession with categorizing the supernatural. But he understood the fear beneath the words. He had once lived in a world that hunted anomalies with similar fervor. Halbrecht studied him with a scrutiny meant to peel back flesh and bone and stare directly at the soul. "You will come aboard my vessel. You will be examined, classified, contained." Contain. The word sharpened within Sasuke's thoughts like broken glass. His cloak rustled as a faint breeze cut through the ruins. He took a single step back, not in fear, but in defiance of direction. Instantly, the acolytes tightened formation, weapons humming as they primed for lethal discharge. A Skitarii raised an arm and projected a tight beam of crimson light across Sasuke's chest, mapping him with mechanical precision. Data streamed across its ocular implants. Subject exhibits anomalous energy signatures. Classification unknown. Psychic disturbance present. Probability of demonic corruption. Variable. The whisper curled in Sasuke's skull, chanting faintly, almost amused. "They fear what you might awaken." Halbrecht snapped his head toward the Skitarii. "Prepare the null restraints. He is to be sedated the moment he resists." Sasuke's fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, and a subtle tension rippled through the ruin. The air grew sharper, denser, as though bracing itself for collision. Then something unexpected happened. A single guardsman, trembling but driven by misguided courage or blind desperation, staggered forward. His voice cracked as he shouted, "My Lord Inquisitor, he fought the traitor Marines, saved us when we could not." Hulbrecht silenced him with a single gesture. "Your testimony is irrelevant. If this being is untainted, the Emperor will reveal it. If he is tainted, we will incinerate him, along with this entire region if necessary." The sky growled thunder in response, though no storm clouds remained. Sasuke felt the weight of 100 rifle barrels aimed at him. He sensed the coiling tension in Halbrecht's armored form, the suppressed zeal ready to explode into sanctioned violence. He could annihilate them if forced. He could vanish into the ruins or unleash the lightning coiled inside him. But every instinct told him that fleeing now would flood this world with consequences he could not yet predict. He exhaled slowly. His hand lifted from the sword hilt. Halbrecht nodded once, acknowledging not surrender, but control. "Detain him," he ordered. A wave of acolytes advanced with chains wrought of an unfamiliar metal that radiated a cold, oppressive aura. The null shackles, instruments forged specifically to bind minds, not limbs. They closed around Sasuke's wrists, sealing with a hiss that extinguished the shimmer of chakra for a heartbeat. The sensation was suffocating, alien, as though the world had momentarily forgotten he existed. The whisper recoiled sharply, then returned with curiosity sharpened to a blade. "Let them take you. Their fear will guide the next revelation." Sasuke met Halbrecht's stare with silent resolve as the restraints tightened. The Inquisitor's voice carried finality. "You will answer to the Inquisition." The ramp groaned as they guided Sasuke toward the waiting warship. The battlefield receded behind him. The shattered cathedral, the drifting ash, the graves marked by fire and despair. The darkness of the ship swallowed him, cold and absolute. And as the doors sealed with a thunderous clang, the warp stirred again, gentle, patient, waiting for him inside the metal womb of his captors. The corridors swallowed him in iron and shadow, a labyrinth forged not for comfort, but for containment. The air aboard the black ship tasted of sterilized metal and burnt oil, carrying faint undertones of incense meant to mask the stench of fear and psychic residue. Every step echoed with a hollow clang, as though the vessel itself groaned beneath the burden of the thousands of souls it carried. Captives, psychers, the doomed and the damned. Sasuke walked among them in silence, wrists locked in null restraints that pressed against his skin with a cold pulse, extinguishing chakra every time it stirred in defiance. The acolytes surrounded him in tight formation, their weapons angled with clinical caution. Their faith was not loud or frantic like the guardsman's prayers. It was silent, cold, sharpened into obedience. They watched him as one watches an unexploded shell, knowing it could detonate at the slightest provocation. Even the Skitari, with their half-mechanical brains, evaluated him constantly, lenses focusing and refocusing, as though attempting to translate his existence into logical parameters. Sasuke absorbed every detail. The architecture of the ship was deliberately oppressive. Narrow passageways, choking arches, metallic icons of the Emperor carved with accusing precision. There was no softness, no warmth, no hint of humanity beyond the hushed murmurs of prisoners echoing through distant vents. Each voice trembled with dread, forming a chorus of despair that seeped into the bones of the ship. He was ushered into a containment chamber marked with dozens of purity seals, their parchment edges fluttering in the draft like dying moth wings. The door sealed behind him with a hydraulic sigh, cutting off the outside world in a single breath. Inside, the chamber was circular and bare, illuminated by a single lumen strip that cast a pallid light across the walls. Chains hung from the ceiling, some rusted, some new, each etched with holy scripture meant to suppress psychic strength. Acolytes guided him toward the central dais. Their grip was firm, but careful, as if touching him too forcefully might provoke an unseen reaction. The null shackles tightened again, suppressing chakra, until Sasuke felt the hollow ache of absence, an emptiness he had not experienced since losing his arm years before. "Secure him," Halbrecht ordered from the doorway. The Inquisitor stepped inside with the certainty of a man who believed himself shielded by the Emperor's gaze. His movements carried ritualistic purpose. He did not look at Sasuke as a person, but as an anomaly, a specimen to be dissected by doctrine and flame. He gestured once, and a servo skull drifted forward, projecting lines of red scanning light that glided across Sasuke's skin. "Your reaction to the warp disturbance was notable," Halbrecht said. "No mortal, untrained and uninitiated, endures such contact without screaming. Some break entirely. Some become vessels for corruption. You resisted." Sasuke met his gaze with quiet indifference. "Your world is not mine." Halbrecht paused. Though Sasuke had spoken little since his capture, the weight behind those words was unmistakable. Not arrogance, certainty. The certainty of someone forged in battlefields the Inquisition had never imagined. "You claim origin beyond Imperial record," Halbrecht mused. "Irrelevant. All that matters is your nature, and whether it threatens mankind." The servo skull emitted a shrill tone as its scans reached the limit of comprehension. Acolytes exchanged uneasy glances. One of them whispered, "His energy readings fluctuate between psychic and something else." Halbrecht silenced him with a single look. "Begin the test." Two robed psychers entered, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow from sacrifice. They approached Sasuke with trembling hands raised, their minds reaching outward like weak, flickering sparks. The air thickened instantly. Sasuke felt pressure building, the touch of foreign minds brushing against the edges of his consciousness. Instinct surged. His Sharingan ignited with a burning whirl, reacting not with aggression, but with defense. The psychers froze mid-incantation, choking on their own breath as the Rinnegan's presence spread through the chamber like cold fire. Halbrecht stiffened, his gauntleted hand instinctively reaching for the purity seals at his belt. The psychers collapsed to their knees, clutching their skulls in agony. Their breaths came in shuddering gasps, as though Sasuke's gaze alone had scraped their minds raw. They scrambled back, horror painted across their features. He looked into us," one of them whispered, voice cracking. "Not as a man does, as something deeper." Halbrecht stepped forward, face unreadable behind his helm. "What did you see within him?" The psyker shivered violently. A storm, boundless, cold, and watching itself. Silence suffocated the chamber. Halbrecht's tone shifted, no longer merely commanding, but edged with the faint tremor of awe. "You are not a demon, but you are not mortal either. The warp reacts to you the way flame reacts to oil." Sasuke kept his gaze steady, though inside he felt the lingering whisper stir, amused by the terror he instilled. "You see, they cannot define you. Their words are chains, yet none can hold." Halbrecht motioned to the acolytes, who resumed their positions with visible hesitation. He must be contained more thoroughly. Prepare the excruciators. Sasuke's jaw hardened. Pain was familiar. Torture was not unknown to him. But here, The methods were not simply physical. They were designed to peel back the soul, to test the limits of sanity, to extract truth through suffering sanctified by faith. Acolytes retrieved a lattice of metallic restraints from a nearby alcove, humming with psychic suppression fields. As they approached, the whispers thickened around Sasuke like fog, commenting on the ritual with morbid fascination. They wish to break you, but they do not understand the nature of what you carry. Sasuke did not react outwardly, but his chakra pushed against the null shackles with a slow-burning intensity. Halbrecht watched, expression hardening. Your cooperation will determine whether you walk this ship as a prisoner. His voice dropped to a chilling calm, or never leave it at all. The restraints locked into place around Sasuke's body, each connection ringing with sanctified metal. The chamber dimmed, incense burned, and as the first tendrils of psychic pressure pressed into his skull, Sasuke realized the Inquisition was not merely testing him. They were trying to break open the mysteries of his power. The warp stirred in response, eager to witness the outcome. The hum of the suppression lattice deepened, vibrating through the chamber like the distant heartbeat of some slumbering colossus. Sasuke felt the pressure intensify, not upon his skin, but within his mind, as if invisible hands were prying apart the seams of his consciousness in search of weaknesses. The null restraints pulsed again, draining chakra with mechanical hunger, leaving behind a hollow ache that crawled beneath his ribs. He remained silent, breathing slow and measured, refusing to let the Inquisition see what he endured. Halbrecht observed from behind a curtain of incense smoke, his silhouette sharp against the dim lumen glow. He stood like a statue carved from doctrine and ruthlessness, hands clasped behind his back, helm angled toward Sasuke with unblinking scrutiny. Acolytes moved around him with ritual precision, adjusting dials, reciting litanies, engraving new purity seals into the metal as if reinforcing a cage around an unpredictable storm. One of the junior psychers approached again, though his steps faltered with each pace. His face was pale, lips trembling from the earlier contact. Yet he obeyed, lifting a trembling hand toward Sasuke. "Begin secondary probe," he whispered, his voice cracked. The moment his mind reached outward, Sasuke felt it, a timid pressure like ripples touching the edge of a vast lake. The psycher's thoughts brushed against his, seeking entry, seeking understanding. They found neither. Instead, they met the Rinnegan. The probe shattered upon contact. A psychic shock rolled outward from Sasuke unintentionally, cracking the lumen strips overhead and sending the psyker reeling backward with a strangled cry. Acolytes rushed to restrain him as he convulsed, blood trickling from both nostrils. His eyes were wide with terror, fixed on Sasuke as if beholding an abyss. He showed me nothing," the psyker gasped. "Not a memory, not a thought. It was like staring into an endless mirror reflecting itself. The closer I looked, the further the reflection went." Halbrecht's helm turned slightly. "The Rinnegan interacts with the warp," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "But not as a demonic gate, nor as a psychic lens. Something else. Something older." The Inquisitor approached, stepping into the faint circle of light that bathed Sasuke's restrained form. "Tell me," Halbrecht said, his voice low, resonant. "What are your eyes?" Sasuke stared back without answering. Halbrecht waited only a breath. Then he gestured sharply. "Bring in Subject 12. Acolytes dragged a frail figure into the chamber, a young woman whose eyes were bound with iron clasps, robe stained with dried tears. Her chains rattled as she moved with hesitant steps, guided by 2 robed attendants. Her aura was faint, fragile, flickering, like a candle struggling not to be snuffed out. She was a psyker, and she was dying. Sasuke felt her presence immediately. It was not malicious, nor curious, nor probing. It was a quiet suffering, a slow unraveling of a mind forced to endure visions mortals were never meant to see. Her breath quickened when she sensed the pressure radiating from him. Halbrecht spoke softly, almost gently. This one is already lost. Her mind destabilizes with every passing hour. If she falls to corruption, she will be euthanized. Let us see whether your presence hastens or delays her demise. A cold anger stirred in Sasuke's chest, but he remained motionless. The attendants pushed the girl closer until she stood only a few steps away. Her bound hands shook. "Please," she whispered, voice hollow. "Don't let it take me." Sasuke's eyes narrowed. The warp surged again, not from him, not from the psychers, but from the girl herself. Her breathing hitched, then choked. Her spine arched violently as invisible tendrils clawed through her mind, twisting her thoughts into frantic spirals. The chamber dimmed as psychic static filled the air, rattling metal and trembling lumen lights. "Contain her," an acolyte shouted, fumbling with a warding implement. Too late. The girl screamed. It was not a human scream, but a psychic shriek, a soul tearing itself open. The raw force slammed into Sasuke, into Halbrecht, into the entire chamber like a tidal wave of anguish. Visions erupted, sickly worlds drowning in rot, star systems devoured by tendrils of nightmare, demons clawing from the void with mouths of endless hunger. And in the center of it all, a single eye, vast, lidless, filled with colors that had no name, stared back at Sasuke through the rift the girl had unwillingly become. For a heartbeat, Sasuke could not breathe. Then the Rinnegan responded. His chakra surged against the restraints, violent enough to crack the metal around his wrists. The null field strained, flickering as his energy flooded the chamber in a cold shock. The visions shattered, replaced by a sudden stillness. Sasuke's gaze locked onto the girl, and something within the Rinnegan extended outward. Not to harm, not to probe, but to sever. The warp's tendrils recoiled. The girl collapsed into unconsciousness, her breathing weak but steady. The chamber fell silent. Acolytes stared in disbelief. The psychers trembled openly. Even the servo skulls hovered in erratic patterns, their machines confused by the disruption. Halbrecht approached slowly, as one might approach a relic newly unearthed. "You stabilized her mind," he said, voice quiet, incredulous. "No psyker has ever resisted a breach of that magnitude without burning out. And you, untrained, uninitiated, you halted it." Sasuke did not answer. His chest rose with slow, controlled breaths, the echoes of that vision still flickering across the edges of consciousness. Halbrecht leaned closer. "Your power is not a threat to the warp. It is something the warp recognizes, responds to." Sasuke's gaze darkened. The whisper slipped back into his mind, curling around each word like smoke. "You see now, don't you? You are not merely a visitor in this realm. You were drawn here because your eyes reflect what the warp craves: shape, control, direction." Halbrecht stepped back, realization settling like a weight upon his shoulders. "You are a danger," he said softly, "not because you serve chaos, but because chaos might seek to serve you." The chamber's lights flickered ominously. Sasuke felt the warp watching again, closer than before, hungrier. The chamber's lumen strips flickered in uneasy rhythm, as if the ship itself sensed the presence now gathering just beyond the veil. The scent of incense thickened, burned faster, curling into frantic ribbons that danced around the purity seals lining the walls. Acolytes scrambled to reinforce the sigils, their hands shaking as they pressed wax and parchment onto cold metal. The psykers huddled against the far wall, whispering broken prayers through trembling lips. Even the Skitarii outside the chamber paused, their mechanical whirring slowing as anomalous readings flooded their senses. Sasuke felt the shift immediately. It was not a noise or a sound. It was a presence, a pressure. The subtle, distinct sensation of being observed, not by the ship, not by the Inquisition, not by any mortal mind, but by something older than this galaxy's recorded history, something vast, something amused. Halbrecht took a step back, gauntlet tightening around the hilt of his sanctified blade. Though he hid behind his helm, Sasuke sensed the Inquisitor's rising dread with clarity. The air vibrated as if carrying the slow, deliberate inhalation of a colossal, unseen force. The warp was stirring, its attention sharpened like the eye of a predator catching the scent of prey or potential. "Seal the chamber," Halbrecht commanded, voice harsh, as if he were trying to chain fear into obedience. "Activate all wards. Prepare the null fields." Acolytes rushed to obey, chanting sigils of protection. But their voices quivered. Their faith faltered. They knew, as Halbrecht must have known, that whatever watched them now was beyond their rituals and their parchments of ink and hope. Sasuke's restraints tightened again, null energy surging in an attempt to suppress the growing fluctuation around him. The metal groaned under the pressure. Chakra fought against the suppression instinctively, rising in cold, precise waves that wrapped around his spine like coils of lightning. A whisper swept through the chamber, not inside his mind, all around. A flutter of slow, resonant breath that seeped through the cracks of reality. "He is awake." The psykers whimpered, pressing their foreheads to the floor. One of them clawed at his own face, nails scraping skin as he gasped, "Not a demon! Not a demon! Not a demon! Something else, something watching us through him." A ripple passed through the chamber, subtle but undeniable, like the brush of a fingertip against glass. The purity seals fluttered violently. The incense flame stretched upward in a long, unnatural thread. The air shimmered, bending light around Sasuke, as if reality itself was leaning toward him. The warp pressure grew heavier, denser, until every heartbeat in the room felt synchronized with an unseen pulse. The ship's metal bulkheads groaned as though the vessel were drifting toward a gravitational well that did not exist. Halbrecht raised his blade. "Whatever you are speaking to," he said, voice steady by force alone, "you will resist it. Do you understand me, anomaly?" Sasuke did not answer. His eyes were fixed on a patch of empty air where shadows had begun to twist. Not with shape, not with form, but with suggestion, a distortion, a smear of impossible angles that strained against comprehension. The whisper deepened. "Uchiha, child of broken loyalties, wanderer carved from storm and tragedy." The shadows flickered. "We had seen your power." Sasuke's pulse steadied. His breathing slowed. Something inside him, the instinct honed from battles, loss, betrayal, and ascension, flared with cold clarity. He had faced gods before. He had confronted fate itself. He did not fear a voice hiding behind unreality. The distortion thickened into a pulse of light, blue, purple, gold, shifting in patterns that defied thought. The air folded inward, and for a moment the chamber vanished. The ship vanished. Halbrecht and the acolytes became silhouettes drowned in shadow. Sasuke stood at the edge of a vast psychic plane, and before him, for an impossible heartbeat, a being took shape. Not body, not face, but presence, a silhouette woven from knowledge and madness, 1,000 eyes blinking in patterns that resembled prophecy, feathers and flames shifting into books, into smoke, into nothing. Tzinch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate. Yet even as the impression formed, it dissolved, refusing to be captured by a single mortal mind. Its voice, soft as silk and sharp as broken mirrors, filled the void around Sasuke. You are an uncut wound in reality. The shadows coiled closer, a contradiction wrapped inside mortal flesh. A whisper brushed the edge of Sasuke's consciousness, testing the boundaries of his mind like a lock examined by a knowing hand. With eyes that see destiny, and eyes that deny it. The Rinnegan pulsed violently. A resonance shot through the psychic plane, fracturing the shadows, sending ripples across the warped vision. The being paused, surprised not by defiance, but by the sheer impossibility of the reaction. You resist. Sasuke's gaze hardened. His voice cut through the void. I do not serve your gods. The shadows trembled with something like laughter, an ancient, cold amusement. We do not ask for service. We ask for potential. The chamber snapped back into existence. Halbrecht and his acolytes staggered as the pressure lifted abruptly. A purity seal burst into ash. The lumen flickered back to life, casting sputtering light across the scorched chamber walls. The distortion faded. The presence receded, but not fully. Never fully. Sasuke remained standing in the restraints, chest rising and falling in calm rhythm. Halbrecht stared at him with a new expression. No longer merely suspicion or fear, but a dawning, horror wrapped in fascination. Something reached through you, the Inquisitor whispered. Something spoke through you. Sasuke's eyes shifted slowly toward him, the Rinnegan still faintly glowing. Halbrecht stepped back, voice trembling beneath his armor. The warp is watching you. Outside the chamber, alarms howled, but Sasuke knew the truth before anyone else could speak it. The warp wasn't just watching, it was waiting. The alarm klaxons wailed like metallic banshees, their shrill cries vibrating through the walls of the black ship, as if the vessel itself felt sudden terror. Red lumen lights flickered, staining the iron corridors with a pulsing glow that mimicked a beating heart. The purity seals lining the chamber walls trembled as gusts of recycled air swept through the vents, carrying the scent of burning metal. Voices erupted beyond the containment door, sharp commands, hurried footsteps, the distinct thunder of armored boots striking deck plating. Halbrecht spun toward the entrance. Report! A Vox officer's panicked voice crackled through the ship-wide channel. Boarding action, unknown cultist faction, breach on lower decks, demonic signatures rising across sectors 6 through 9. We cannot contain... The transmission dissolved into static, followed by a guttural scream. Halbrecht's helm snapped toward Sasuke, the crimson lenses narrowing. This is no coincidence. His voice shook with the conviction of a man who believed the warp itself had orchestrated the assault. They felt what touched you. They want you. Sasuke's gaze lifted, calm, despite the chaos. The restraints around him pulsed with null energy, suppressing the surge of chakra that instinctively rose to meet the threat. The echoes of the warp's whisper still lingered at the edge of his consciousness. Silent now, but awake, waiting. An explosion rocked the vessel. Dust fell from the ceiling in drifting clouds. The chamber door shuddered as if struck by a battering ram. Acolytes raised their weapons, forming a defensive line around Halbrecht, though fear trembled beneath their discipline. We must move him, an acolyte urged, voice breaking. If the cult reaches this sector, they will not take him, Halbrecht snapped. stepping toward the dais where Sasuke stood bound. Release the peripheral restraints. Keep the null shackles active. If he breaks free, we cannot predict. The door buckled inward. A violent burst of green fire tore through the chamber entrance, melting iron and purity seals alike. The scent of rot and charred incense filled the air. Figures spilled through the breach, robed cultists coated in rusted icons of chaos, their flesh marked by unnatural symbols that pulsed with sickly light. Eyes burned with fanatic devotion as they surged into the chamber, chanting in warped tongues. "Claim the vessel," one shrieked, voice layered with demonic distortion. The changer calls to the eye-bearer. Halbrecht roared an order, and the chamber erupted into battle. Bolter rounds thundered, each shot echoing like a hammer against the cathedral-like walls. Cultists fell in splashes of corrupted blood, their bodies dissolving into smears of ash and mucus, but more flooded through the breach. Too many, too frantic, too intoxicated by their own madness to fear death. Sasuke watched as chaos unfolded before him, the air distorted around the cultists, warp energy thickening like fog, causing their movements to blur into jagged patterns. Each scream carried fragments of fate, prophecy, insanity, things his Rinnegan instinctively sensed, though he did not understand them. One acolyte rushed to reinforce his restraints, fingers fumbling over sanctified metal. "We must secure him, if the cultists free him." A shadow streaked across the room. A blade of warped bone punched through the acolyte's chest, lifting him off his feet. Blood splattered across the rune-etched floor. The cultist wielding the weapon hissed a prayer to Tzeentch, eyes fixed on Sasuke with burning fascination. "The eye that sees all paths," he whispered. "The gift is waking. He is waking." Sasuke's restraint lattice groaned. His chakra surged violently in response to the killing intent around him. The null shackles flared, pressing hard against his wrists, burning his skin. Another cultist lunged for the controls of the restraints. Halbrecht intercepted him with a single stroke of his power blade. Sparks erupted as he severed the cultist in two, ichor spraying across the metal floor. "Keep them away from him," he roared. "Do not let them touch the machinery." But the cultists did not fear death. They welcomed it, rushing toward the dais with frenzied devotion, as though martyrdom would deliver them into the arms of their god. The air grew thick with warp pressure, the same malignant presence that had spoken through the void only moments before. The temperature dropped. Frost crawled across the chains binding Sasuke. A ripple passed through him, not from outside, but from somewhere deep within. His Rinnegan pulsed, reacting to the swelling psychic resonance with instinctive precision. The restraints strained to contain him. The ship trembled again as another explosion tore through the lower decks. Flames surged down the corridor outside, casting long shadows through the breach. Screams echoed up the hall, followed by the heavy crash of collapsing bulkheads. "Evacuate the psychers," Halbrecht commanded. "Seal all entry points." But it was too late. A towering figure stepped into the doorway, clad in armor twisted by the warp, its surface engraved with shifting runes that writhed like living serpents. Its helm had no face, only a single luminous slit that glowed with unnatural intelligence. A thousand-sun sorcerer, a champion of Tzeentch. Halbrecht's voice dropped into a deadly whisper. "Sorcerer." The Marine raised his staff, its tip crowned with an eye-shaped crystal that seemed to stare directly at Sasuke. The sorcerer's voice echoed with layered tones. "You do not understand what you caged, Inquisitor. He is not yours to bind." Sasuke felt the warp twisting around him again, soft, seductive, unavoidable. The sorcerer was not speaking to Halbrecht. He was speaking to him. Child of another world, your power has no place in their chains. Halbrecht lunged forward, blade raised high. The sorcerer flicked his staff. A blast of warp fire hurled the Inquisitor across the chamber, slamming him into the far wall with bone-crushing force. Acolytes screamed and rushed forward, only to be dissolved by a sweeping tide of blue flame. The sorcerer stepped towards Sasuke, each stride bending the air. "Awaken," he murmured. The null shackles sparked violently. The restraints cracked, and as the chamber shook beneath the clash of faith and corruption, Sasuke felt the final thread of suppression begin to snap. The fire of the warp reflected in his eyes. The storm inside him answered. The restraint split with a crack that sounded like a verdict passed by the universe itself. Sparks burst from ruptured null coils, scattering across the chamber floor as the psychic suppression lattice overloaded and died in a shower of blue flame. The air shuddered, vibrating with a sudden surge of energy that radiated from Sasuke like a cold, expanding wave. His chakra, long suppressed and strangled, surged back into existence with a force that bent the light around him and twisted the drifting incense smoke into spirals. For a moment, everything froze. The sorcerer, mid-step, halted as the sudden shift rippled through the warp. Halbrecht, struggling to rise after being slammed against the wall, stared at the ruptured restraints with horror. Acolytes, who remained alive, instinctively backed away, even as cultists pressed forward with renewed fervor, chanting praises to Tzinch as if the breaking of the shackles was a sacred omen. Sasuke exhaled, the breath steady and cold. The remnants of the null shackles fell from his wrists like broken manacles, hitting the iron dais with dull, metallic thuds. His eyes lifted, Sharingan in one, Rinnegan in the other, reflecting the blaze of warp fire, the trembling psychers, the sorcerer whose focus sharpened with predatory interest. The Thousand Suns champion tilted his head, voice embroidered with layered echoes. Now you begin to resemble what the warp sensed within you, a fracture in fate, a mirror that does not show what should be. Sasuke did not speak. He did not waste breath on questions or warnings. Instead, he moved. Lightning flickered across his skin, bursting in a cascade of blue arcs as he blurred forward. The sorcerer raised his staff to intercept, but Sasuke had already vanished from the line of attack, reappearing behind him with a twisting arc of chakra-laced force that ripped through the air with a shriek. The sorcerer's armor flared with wards, barely deflecting the blow as he staggered forward. Sparks erupted where Sasuke's strike met warp-forged ceramite. "Magnificent," the sorcerer murmured, even as cracks splintered across his shoulder plate. "Your power is neither psychic nor physical. It is something unclaimed." Cultists screamed and rushed the dais, drunk with their god's blessing. Sasuke raised his hand, lightning bursting outward in a jagged bloom. Chidori Nagashi erupted in all directions, shearing through flesh and bone with surgical precision. The cultists were flung backward, falling like broken marionettes, their blood sizzling where it touched the runes etched into the floor. Halbrecht pulled himself upright, bracing his weight on his blade. "Do not let him escape," he shouted, though the command trembled under the weight of disbelief. "He cannot be permitted to—" His voice died as Sasuke turned. The Rinnegan glowed with an inner storm, a resonance that bent the shadows around him. Halbrecht froze, not out of paralysis, but from the instinctive awareness of something far beyond his comprehension. Sasuke's gaze held no malice, but it held inevitability. The sorcerer thrust his staff forward. Warp energy spiraled from the crystal tip, coiling into a bolt of violet flame that streaked towards Sasuke. The attack twisted the air, carrying the scent of burning prophecy. Sasuke's hand moved in a blur, sweeping the attack aside with a vortex of chakra that tore a jagged scar into the metal floor. The sorcerer laughed, delighted. You warp the Imperium without touching it. You impose your will upon mine. His voice deepened, twisting into something ancient. The changer has not erred. You do not belong to this realm, yet you shape it. Sasuke's expression darkened at the implication. The sorcerer lifted his staff again, runes igniting across the chamber. A sigil formed beneath Sasuke's feet, glowing with malefic light. Before he could move, the sigil exploded upward in a spiraling column of spectral chains, warp tentacles meant to bind, consume, claim. They never touched him. The Rinnegan pulsed. The tentacles evaporated mid-air as if cut by an unseen blade. The sorcerer's eyes widened behind his helm. Impossible. Sasuke stepped forward. The floor cracked beneath his bare foot. The air around him seemed to freeze, even the drifting ash held in suspension. But before he could strike, a wave of terrified voices cut through the moment. The Psykers. They huddled against the far walls, trembling as they stared at Sasuke, not with fear of him, but with fear of what they saw blooming around him. They could sense it more clearly than anyone else. A sigil, invisible to ordinary sight, was taking shape around Sasuke. Not one carved by chaos, not one imposed by the Inquisition. Something unbidden, something that formed naturally around him from the warp's reaction to his presence. An outline of power threading itself into prophecy. He carries a mark, one Psyker whispered through sobs. A mark without a name. Halbrecht stiffened. Explain. The Psyker shook violently. Not daemon, not emperor. Something, waiting, watching. The warp is circling him as if he is a herald. Halbrecht's expression twisted. Heresy. It is not his choice, another Psyker cried. It is being written onto him, as if the warp is engraving a title he did not ask for. The sorcerer stepped back, awe replacing aggression. A prophet unchosen, a vessel unbound. Sasuke's jaw tightened. Prophet, vessel. These words tasted too close to chains. He moved again, launching himself at the sorcerer with a strike that shattered the marine's wards and sent him crashing into the wall. The sorcerer coughed warp fire, armor crumpling under the blow. Still he laughed. You cannot outrun what you are becoming. Sasuke's fist tightened. I decide who I am. He raised his hand for a finishing strike. But the ship lurched violently, alarms blaring anew as fire rolled through the corridor outside. The sorcerer vanished in a burst of warp fire, escaping through a flickering tear in reality before Sasuke could reach him. The breach snapped shut with a clap of displaced air, leaving only scorch marks. Halbrecht staggered, staring at Sasuke with a look torn between fear and necessity. The cultists will return. More will come. They will hunt you. The Imperium will fear you, and the warp will not stop watching. Sasuke did not answer. His eyes drifted to the Psykers, the broken, trembling, powerless. They stared at him with something strange in their gaze. Not worship, not terror, recognition. As though they saw in him not a god, not a savior, but a storm that refused to bow to heaven or hell. The mark, whatever it was, glimmered in the air around him, invisible to all but the warp touched, unwanted, unasked, but growing. A new prophet, born in a world that despised prophecy. The black ship groaned under its own agony as fires spread through the lower decks, each detonation a shuddering convulsion that rippled through the vessel's spine. The alarms wailed in uneven pitches, flickering between mechanical clarity and static distortion, as the warp continued brushing against the ship, like a colossal predator tasting weakened prey. Sasuke stepped through the ruined chamber doorway, boots crunching over shattered purity seals and still smouldering debris. Smoke curled around him, trailing in thin strands that twisted unnaturally toward his Rinnegan, as if even the remnants of flame were drawn to the gravity of his presence. Halbrecht limped after him, armor dented and scorched, but his posture remained rigid. His blade hung loosely in one hand, the other pressed against a bleeding gash beneath the pauldron. He refused help from his acolytes, waving them off with stubborn resolve. "We must reach the upper sanctum," he rasped, forcing his breath to steady. "If the cultists breach the Psyker vaults, the entire ship will be lost." Sasuke did not slow. "Your enemies aren't finished." "They never are," Halbrecht replied, though there was a strange note in his voice, somewhere between wary respect and dread. "But it is not only the Thousand Suns who hunt vessels like this. If the warp weakens the Gellerfield any further—" The corridor ahead trembled with a low, sickening moan, as though the ship itself were suffocating. The lumen lights flickered from red to pale green, then to a sluggish yellow. A thick, humid stench coated the air. Halbrecht's helm snapped forward. "No." A distant roar rolled through the decks, wet, guttural, lingering with the promise of decay. The metal walls corroded in real time, oxidizing in writhing streaks of brown and green. Slime began to drip from the ceiling, pooling in quivering puddles that bubbled with flies large enough to rattle against armor. Sasuke felt the chakra around his spine stiffen in warning. Something immense was boarding the ship, something ancient, something swollen with the blessings of a god who celebrated rot. Halbrecht's voice was a harsh whisper. "Nurgle's servants. Death Guard." As if summoned by the words, a massive silhouette emerged through the smoke ahead. Its armor was the color of diseased flesh, pocked with boils and rusted plates fused to corrupted tissue. Wet chains clinked with each lumbering step, swinging from a swollen frame that seemed too heavy for the deck. The head, if it could be called a head, was buried beneath layers of growth and pustules, with a single glowing eye glaring from a hollow cavity. Behind the first came more and more, plague marines, legionaries of decay. Each footfall released a puff of spores that floated through the air like drifting embers, except each carried the stench of rot. Each hissed softly as if alive. Sasuke instinctively stepped forward, chakra bristling. Halbrecht grabbed his arm. "Do not breathe deeply. Their presence alone spreads corruption." Sasuke glanced at the Marines, then at the pooling slime beneath their feet. "What are they?" "Warriors of Nurgle, the plague god," Halbrecht said, voice grim. "Their bodies are blessed with eternal disease. Their armor is alive. Their touch unravels flesh. Their breath alone can wither worlds." One of the plague marines let out a gurgling laugh, the sound dripping with phlegm. Its voice reverberated through bloated vents in its armor. "Inquisitor, you smell of fear." Its head turned toward Sasuke, lingering. "But you smell wrong." The others chuckled, a chorus of wet, bubbling amusement. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. "They're in my way." He vanished. Lightning erupted in a spiral, the crack of his movement echoing like a splitting sky. He reappeared behind one marine, blade arm raised, chakra concentrated into a razor edge. His strike landed with the force of a thunderbolt, yet it barely pierced through. The blade slid into corrupted flesh, but the marine didn't scream. It didn't stagger. Instead, it turned toward him slowly, almost curiously, as pus dripped down the cracks Sasuke had carved. "Ah," the Marine gurgled. "You sting." The Marine swung a swollen fist the size of a boulder. Sasuke ducked, the blow smashing into the wall and warping it like softened wax. He moved again, faster, weaving around the Marines with blinding speed, delivering strike after strike. But each cut healed with grotesque slowness, sealing with slime and writhing tendrils of diseased tissue. Chakra flared at his fingertips. Chidori. He drove lightning straight into the Marine's chest. The crackling blue light exploded through armor and rot, tearing a crater through the creature's torso. For a moment, the Marine froze. Then it laughed again, low and wet, as worms crawled from the wound to stitch the flesh back together. Halbrecht dragged the wounded acolyte behind cover. "Your power is immense," he shouted, "but they are not beings you can simply cut apart." Sasuke reappeared beside Halbrecht, breathing slow, eyes cold. "Then I'll burn them." He formed a seal. Flames surged, black, consuming. The Amaterasu poured from his eye like living shadow, engulfing the nearest Marine. The Rot warrior staggered, armor melting, flesh blistering beneath the cursed fire. The Plague Marine roared now, not in fear, but in delight. Burning. Yes, yes. Such beautiful pain. It collapsed into a pile of smouldering sludge, yet even that sludge twitched, as if trying to reform. Sasuke felt his jaw tighten. These monsters didn't die easily. Another Marine charged. The floor warped beneath its weight. Sasuke dodged, but spores burst around him as the Marine swung. The air shimmered with corruption, dangerous even to breathe. A faint whisper curled around Sasuke's ear. "Do not fear rot. Fear stagnation. You were not made to stand still." He ignored the voice, focusing instead on the shifting shadow behind the Marines, the corridor warping from more than just decay. Something else was coming, something heavier. The Marines stepped aside, making space as a towering figure ducked beneath the ceiling, entering the ruined hallway with ponderous grace. Rusted bells hung from its pauldron. A scythe forged from bone and corroded steel scraped the floor. A herald of Nurgle. Halbrecht's voice cracked. "Fall back, now." The herald raised its scythe. Rot dripped from the blade like venom. Sasuke stepped forward instead. He saw what needed to happen. If the Death Guard reached the Psycho vaults, the ship would be overrun. If the herald advanced further, Halbrecht and the surviving crew would be consumed. If he retreated now, the warp's interest in him would only grow bolder. He lifted his hand. Lightning spiraled around him. "Get them out," Sasuke said quietly. Halbrecht hesitated. "You'll be overwhelmed." Sasuke met his gaze, Rinnegan pulsing. "Not today." The herald swung. Sasuke moved to meet it. The corridor collapsed into fire, rot, and lightning as the Uchiha faced the armies of decay alone. The herald's scythe met the rising storm of lightning in a clash that sounded like a cathedral collapsing. Sparks of chakra struck droplets of putrid rot, each collision hissing into bursts of smoke that curled like dying breaths. The corridor groaned beneath the force of the impact, metal warping, pipes rupturing, lumens shattering into showers of glass that glittered in the turbulent air. Sasuke slid back across the deck, boots screeching against corroded steel as the herald pressed its advantage with monstrous weight. The creature towered over him, armored in rusted plates bloated with disease, its flesh merging with its armor in pulsing swells. Every breath it exhaled released clouds of spores that drifted like ash, each glowing faintly with plagues waiting to cling to skin, to burrow beneath thought, to consume life with agonizing patience. Its gaze, a single milk-white orb buried deep within a swollen helmet, never blinked. It swung again. Sasuke dodged left, lightning sparking across his skin as the scythe carved a slow, deliberate arc. The blade shattered bulkheads, slicing through steel as though cutting into wet parchment. The deck buckled beneath the sheer force. A wave of noxious fumes burst outward, curdling the air. Sasuke landed lightly atop a fallen support beam, chakra flaring around his feet to keep the surface from crumbling beneath him. The herald turned toward him with a rolling growl, its voice resonating with decay itself. "You shine too brightly. Little spark," it rumbled. "All light must dim. All things rot. Even the gods you knew." Sasuke's gaze hardened. His eyes glowed with a cold, controlled intensity, Sharingan spinning, Rinnegan pulsing with cosmic depth. "Try." He moved again. In a flicker, he was at the herald's flank. Lightning surged along his arm as he thrust a Chidori like a spear into the creature's side. The sound was deafening, 1,000 birds shrieking in chorus, the cry of pure electricity driven into corrupt flesh. The blow struck with ferocity, sinking inches before it met resistance that felt less like armor and more like a wall of rotting steel. The herald groaned, not in pain, but in pleasure. "Yes, break yourself. Feed the garden." The creature seized Sasuke's arm with swollen fingers the size of gauntlets. Rot raced along its grip, creeping toward Sasuke's skin with hungry tendrils. His chakra flared violently. He tore free in a burst of lightning, vanishing before the rot could take hold. When he reappeared, he stood above the herald on a ruptured catwalk that leaned precariously over the corridor. The metal beneath his feet creaked but held. The herald looked up, breathing in the air with grotesque joy. "You move fast for something that still clings to breath." Sasuke raised both arms. The air shimmered. A sphere formed, black as a starless void, a miniature planetary core of chakra compressed with lethal precision. Chibaku Tensei. The corridor groaned as gravity warped. Rusted metal tore free from walls and floors, drawn upward toward the forming singularity. Debris, fallen weapons, shattered armor, everything rose in spiraling chaos. Even the rot-laden slime peeled away from the deck, stretching like taffy as it was pulled toward the growing mass. The herald roared, sinking its blade into the floor to anchor itself. Sasuke dropped the sphere. For a moment, darkness swallowed the corridor. Then the explosion came. The gravitational pulse rippled outward, dragging metal, corruption, and the herald itself into the churning mass. The corridor twisted, walls bending inward as though the ship were being folded. The herald fought, its scythe slicing through torn steel, its body swelling with Nurgle's blessing to resist the pull. But the singularity pulled harder. Chains snapped across the herald's armor. The creature's bloated limbs stretched unnaturally as gravity wrenched them toward the sphere. Rust cracked, flesh tore. Slime dripped upward in writhing ribbons. With a guttural roar, the herald was ripped free of the deck and hurled into the heart of the black orb. The sphere collapsed in an implosive burst. Silence followed, heavy and final. The corridor sagged beneath the strain, beams twisting, lumens flickering. Smoke drifted upward in weak tendrils. The place where the herald had stood was now an empty crater, its edges sizzling with residual energy. Sasuke exhaled once, but the victory felt wrong. The air did not clear. It grew heavier, wetter. Something seeped from the floor, a spreading pool of moss-green sludge that pulsed like a beating organ. From its surface, dozens of tiny pustules rose and burst, releasing clouds of spores that glowed faintly in the dim light. A whisper slithered across the edges of his mind. "You cannot kill decay. You cannot burn disease. You cannot silence rot. Sasuke's jaw tightened. The sludge trembled, rising. A partially reformed hand clawed upward, dripping filth. The herald was regenerating. Albrecht's voice echoed down the corridor, strained but alive. Sasuke, retreat. That thing cannot die in the warp's presence. Sasuke turned, eyes narrowing. He understood. The ship's weakened Geller field allowed warp influence to seep through the cracks, empowering the abominations of chaos, feeding them with unending vitality. He could not win by brute force. He needed to sever the herald from its god's domain. He needed to change the battlefield. Chakra coiled inside him like a swirling tempest. His Rinnegan flared, detecting the subtle tears in reality. Hairline fractures caused by the warp pressing against the ship's wounded frame. Micro rifts flickered throughout the corridor, each a thread of unstable space. He extended his hand. Chakra surged outward, weaving into invisible tendrils that grasped at the cracks in the air. He pulled, not on the herald, not on the ship, but on space itself. The corridor blurred, gravity twisted, the world shifted, and with a sound like the sky being torn open, Sasuke hurled himself and the rotting giant out of the collapsing hallway, and into the warp-scarred void between moments, where even gods struggled for dominion. The herald's roar followed him into the rift, and Sasuke welcomed it. The fabric of reality tore like wet parchment as Sasuke forced the rift open, the edges of space peeling back in jagged spirals of blue and violet. Cold surged up his spine as he crossed the threshold, the air itself turning thin, unreal, as though he had stepped into the hollow between thoughts. Behind him, the herald of Nurgle spilled into the breach with a roar that shook the void. The creature's corpulent form distorted as it crossed the boundary, its armor melting and reforming as the warp embraced it like a favored child. The rift sealed shut behind them with a resonant crack. Silence followed. Not the silence of absence, the silence of being observed by something far larger than silence could hold. Colors with no name bled into existence, warping into rivers of spiraling light. Shapes too vast to comprehend flickered in distant horizons, massive silhouettes drifting like forgotten titans. The ground beneath Sasuke's feet had no texture, yet supported him. The air burned his lungs without heat. His chakra vibrated in uneven pulses, reacting to the living madness suffusing every inch of the warp. The herald straightened with a grotesque wet pop, its bloated mass quivering with delight. "We are seen," it rasped, its voice echoing in layers. "Here, the garden grows strong." Sasuke felt the warp pressing around him. The pressure was suffocating, not in flesh, but in thought. Memories twisted at the edges. Sensations from his past flickered. Itachi's eyes, Naruto's conviction, the pain of old wounds, and warped into distorted reflections. Voices whispered in languages he had never heard yet instinctively understood. He tightened his stance, grounding himself in chakra, letting the familiar warmth of it push back against the gnawing presence of the Imperium. The herald lumbered forward. "Here you are small," it crooned. "Here, all mortals bend." Sasuke's eyes narrowed. "I'm not bending." He moved. The warp distorted around his speed, every step warping into streaks of light as space folded unpredictably. Lightning erupted across his limbs, tracing jagged paths that split the unreal plane with white fire. He appeared above the herald, Chidori blooming in his hand, like a star caught in violent birth. He struck. The sound was not thunder. It was the cracking of thought itself. Warp flesh tore open in a fountain of congealed rot that floated upward in slow, lazy spirals. The herald staggered, gurgling, But instead of falling, it expanded grotesquely, the wound blossoming with tendrils of pus-coated sinew. The warp fed it like a mother pouring poison down a child's throat. "Break yourself," the herald whispered. "Feed me your pain." Sasuke vanished again. He reappeared behind it, slashing with the precision of a surgeon. He tore chunks of flesh off, each chunk writhing before dissolving into vapor. His movements were deliberate, sharp, measured to conserve energy while fighting something that refused the courtesy of death. But the warp twisted him too. The ground beneath him convulsed, rippling like the surface of disturbed water. Gravity inverted, just long enough for his footing to slip. The herald swung its scythe. The blade scraped his shoulder, carving a shallow gash that burned with cold, fungal agony. Rot tried to seep into the wound, but chakra flared violently, repelling it. His breath sharpened. He could not fight this creature forever. Even with the Rinnegan, even with chakra honed by years of war, the warp itself was the herald's ally. Every cut healed. Every strike fueled the rot. Every movement Sasuke made was analyzed by a place that had no rules, no limits, no kindness. The warp pulled at him again, stronger now. He felt a tug in his mind, as if an invisible hand were prying open memories like pages of a fragile book. Scenes twisted, his brother's final moments, Naruto's desperate pleas, the wars he had fought. They distorted, sharpened, and rearranged as though someone were rewriting them. A vast pressure settled behind his thoughts. Then a presence, the same one from before. And now, closer, colder, curious. "Uchiha, wandering spark, you walk unshielded in eternity." Sasuke forced the voice aside, focusing on the herald charging again. He let chakra pour into his hand, more lightning, sharper, faster, forming a blade of pure electrical force. The herald swung, and Sasuke wove beneath the strike, slicing through its knee joint. The limb exploded into slime, the creature toppling with a thunderous crash. But it kept laughing. The warp boiled beneath it, forming new limbs, new growths, new horrors. Sasuke stepped back. Something was changing. The presence pressed harder, clearing the distortion around him like a curtain being drawn back. The warp rippled in concentric rings as a radiant golden force blossomed above, so bright it pierced the realm's madness with sheer will. A throne, a figure, a blinding presence whose light carved order from chaos. Sasuke's breath caught, not from awe, but from the crushing weight of sheer mental gravity. The Emperor. The sight was not physical. It wasn't even real. But it was there, projected across the warp like a sun glimpsed through storm clouds. The force of his existence hit Sasuke like a tidal wave. His knees nearly buckled. His Rinnegan flared violently, resisting the immensity of the psychic shock. The herald shrieked, covering its face as the golden radiance scorched rot from its armor. "No," it howled. "Not here, not his eye." The vision intensified. Sasuke saw the golden throne, saw the stillness of a corpse god ruling a galaxy through sheer force of unbroken thought. The warp recoiled and surged at once. The Emperor's gaze swept across him, not with malice, not with intent, but with a pressure that did not distinguish him from storm, flesh, or shadow. It was the weight of a sun, looking at a spark. Sasuke's vision blurred. Blood ran from his nose. His chakra sputtered. The herald crawled toward him, desperate to escape the radiance, only to be seized by warp tendrils dragging it backward. The Emperor's presence faded like a dying flame. The warp snapped back. Sasuke collapsed to one knee, breath ragged. His vision pulsed. The Rinnegan throbbed with a pain unlike anything he had ever felt. like it had been pressed against the fabric of a god's will. The herald lay scattered across the ground, dissolving into rot. Sasuke forced himself upright. His hands shook, not from fear, from the memory of what he had just touched. He had seen the Emperor and survived, but something had changed inside him, something irreversible. The warp had seen it too. The rift spat him out like a rejected fragment of reality, hurling Sasuke onto cold metal that groaned beneath the sudden shock of impact. He rolled to a stop along a scorched deck, his breath ragged as a thin mist of blood drifted from his nose and dissolved into the air. The warp closed behind him with a violent snap, sealing the tear as if eager to erase proof of his escape. The sudden stillness of the material world hit him like a shock, heavy, suffocating, painfully stable after the infinite distortion he had just endured. He pushed himself to his feet. The black ship was barely recognizable. The corridor stretched before him in a broken spine of torn plating, shattered lumens, and drifting ash. Fires licked at the ceiling, venting sparks that rained over the dead and dying. The air throbbed with klaxon screams and the distant thunder of bolter fire. Psychic wails echoed from deeper within the decks, surges of raw terror rippling through the souls trapped aboard the failing vessel. Halbrecht's voice cut through the chaos, carried by a vox burst that crackled with static. All surviving units fall back to the command sanctum. This ship is being dragged toward the eye. Dragged. Sasuke steadied himself. His vision still pulsed with the afterimage of the Emperor's psychic radiance. An echo pressed into the deepest folds of his mind. The weight of it lingered behind his eyes like a bruise. His Rinnegan throbbed with a slow ache, the memory of divine pressure reverberating through every thought. He moved. Each step grew steadier as his chakra adapted again to the physical realm's restraints. Yet the warp had left its mark. His senses were sharp in ways they had never been before. Every flicker of psychic energy, every ripple of malice, every tremor of fear radiating from the psychovolts sang through the air like threads tugged by unseen hands. The corridor ahead erupted as a massive explosion tore through a bulkhead. A wave of heat roared across him, shoving him back a step. From the smoke emerged figures drenched in heretical iconography. Chaos Marines bearing the twisted sigils of multiple war bands, slaughter erupting in their wake. They fired instantly. Bolts of corrupted mass reactive rounds streaked toward him. Sasuke flickered sideways, the Chidori's glow sparking off his hand as he weaved between the shots. He reappeared behind the nearest Marine, driving a lightning-infused kick into the back of its helm. The force bent armor and snapped the traitor's spine with a crack like shattered stone. The others roared and swung chain blades that screamed for blood. Sasuke moved through them with cold precision, his movements seamless, practiced, merciless. The Sharingan tracked every motion. The Rinnegan mapped the distortions in the air as warp energy bled from their armor. His strikes were calculated to shatter joints, disrupt corrupted flesh, and silence breath before it could escape. But there were too many, and the ship was breaking. Gravity lurched beneath him as the entire vessel tilted sharply to starboard. A deep, groaning rumble echoed through the hull. Something enormous was pulling on the black ship from outside. Something tidal, ancient, hungry. He sensed it before he heard Halbrecht's next shout. The Eye of Terror is pulling us in. Geller Field is collapsing in all sectors. Sasuke felt the warp press against the hull, like a tidal wave pushing against glass. The air shimmered with micro-tears. The floor warped beneath his feet. Bolts of reality sickness crawled along the bulkheads in veins of crackling light. He sprinted toward the command sanctum. Bodies, both Imperial and heretic, littered the path. Blood pooled in reflective black sheets. A door lay torn from its hinges, and beyond it, the sanctum was a storm of desperate defiance. Halbrecht stood at the center of the room, armor smoking, faceplate cracked, delivering commands with the frenzy of a commander holding back an ocean. "Reroute power to the stabilizers," he shouted. "Divert all remaining psyker containment energies to shield the bridge." Tech priest chanted Binharic prayers as sparks erupted from damaged consoles. Servo arms welded ruptured cables. Shock troopers fired from barricades at swarms of cultists climbing through torn vents. The entire sanctum shook as the ship groaned under cosmic pressure, each vibration threatening to snap the vessel in half. Halbrecht turned as Sasuke entered. For an instant, the Inquisitor froze. Sasuke still bore the sheen of warp exposure, chakra swirling like a storm with an unnatural shimmer, eyes glowing with a depth that did not belong to mortals. Even standing still, he looked like a wound in the world's fabric. Halbrecht regained his voice. "You survived the breach." It was not a question. Sasuke stepped closer, gaze sharp. "Your ship is about to be swallowed." Halbrecht pointed toward a massive viewing aperture, its reinforced barrier cracked but intact. Sasuke saw it, the eye of terror, a colossal wound in the void, swirling with colors of madness, rage, despair, and unspeakable hunger. The warp storm churned like a living ocean, tendrils of unreality stretching outward to drag the black ship into its maw. Starships burned in distant currents, their wreckage spiraling like dying embers. Demonic silhouettes danced across the surface of the storm. The ship teetered at the edge of annihilation. "We cannot escape," Halbrecht said, voice grim. "If the Geller field fails completely, we will be consumed." Sasuke lifted his hand slowly, feeling space ripple around them. The warp responded instantly, far too easily, drawn to him like dust to a flame. His Rinnegan pulsed with a resonance that echoed the storm outside. Halbrecht stiffened. "What are you doing?" "I can pull," Sasuke said quietly, "if the warp wants me." Halbrecht's eyes widened behind cracked glass. "You would anchor us?" Sasuke did not answer. He stepped forward, extending his chakra beyond the barrier. The warp surged toward him, spiraling in tendrils of iridescent light. As eager as a predator waiting to strike, he reached into it. Reality trembled. The ship lurched away from the eye, stabilizing for a moment as Sasuke pulled on immaterial forces that no mortal was built to touch. The warp roared back. Tendrils of unreality whipped at him, each strike laced with malice. His vision blurred. Blood dripped from his nose again. His chakra flickered violently. Halbrecht shouted commands, but they were distant, swallowed by the roar of cosmic pressure. Sasuke strained. The ship inched back. For a heartbeat, victory tasted possible. Then the warp screamed. A pulse of psychic force slammed into him so violently the deck beneath his feet cracked. His knees buckled. The link snapped. The ship dropped toward the eye again. Sasuke collapsed to one knee, chest heaving. He had touched infinity, and infinity had struck back. Halbrecht rushed to his side, voice sharp. "Sasuke, get up. We need you." Sasuke raised his head slowly, and the warp whispered through the glass. "You cannot control the storm. You can only become part of it." The words slithered through Sasuke's mind like a blade of cold mercury, each whisper slicing through the remnants of focus he had managed to gather. The warp's voice was everywhere at once, behind him, within him, bleeding through the cracked viewing barrier where the eye of terror churned like a wounded god's heart. The black ship lurched again, pitching sideways as gravitational tides dragged it closer to the abyss. Alarms shrieked, consoles sparked. A tech priest collapsed in a shower of sparks as a conduit exploded behind him. Halbrecht seized Sasuke's shoulder, gauntlet trembling with urgency. "You cannot listen to it. The warp is not a voice. It's a prison of lies. Get up." Sasuke pushed himself upright, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle like molten iron across his limbs. His vision flickered. The Rinnegan pulsed with chaotic rings that refused to settle into their natural rhythm. Chakra swirled inside him, but it no longer moved cleanly. It twisted, warped, vibrated in disharmonic waves, as though contaminated by the echoes of what he had touched. "Your ship will not survive," Sasuke said quietly. Halbrecht released him, expression unreadable behind the cracked helm. "Then help us. If the warp wants you, use it. Use the link and drag us away." Sasuke's head turned slowly toward the viewing aperture. The eye roared in cosmic silence, its storm spiraling outward in impossible geometries. The closer the ship drifted, the more the air thickened with psychic static. His skin prickled, his breath tightened. Every pulse of chakra he summoned answered with a distortion, a reminder that he had reached into a realm mortals were not permitted to touch, a reminder that he had survived something no psyker ever had. He stepped toward the glass. Space twisted. A warp tide crashed against the Geller field, sending ripples across the sanctum. The lights dimmed. Screams rose from deeper in the ship as madness seeped in like a rising flood. Sasuke raised his hand. Energy gathered at his fingertips. Chakra surged, wild, cold, and luminous. The entire ship shuddered. "Sasuke," Halbrecht barked. "Hold control. Do not let it consume you." But the warp had already felt him. A tendril of unreality curled from the eye, slithering across the void like a searching limb. It found the weakened barrier. It found the link Sasuke had attempted to forge moments earlier. And it found him again. The sanctum vanished. He stood on a plain of dunes that pulsed like breathing flesh. A sky of fractured mirrors floated above him, each reflecting versions of himself, some distorted, some broken, some blazing with impossible power. The warp had pulled his mind inward. The present spoke. "You wish to command the storm. You wish to chain infinity." Sasuke's jaw tightened. "I want your influence out of this world." Laughter rolled across the unreal desert, ancient and amused. "Foolish child. Mortals do not command the warp. They drown in it." The dunes shifted. From them emerged forms, thousands of them, shadows of shinobi. Every comrade and enemy he had ever known, their faces hollowed, their bodies dripping with black sludge. They reached toward him in silent accusation. "This is what you are," the voice whispered, "a vessel of grief, a seeker of impossible answers." The shadows surged forward. Sasuke's eyes blazed. Lightning erupted in all directions. Black flame spiraled from his gaze, incinerating illusions by the dozens. The warp rippled beneath him, buckling under the pressure of his defiance. But for every shadow he tore apart, two more rose from the rotting dunes, crawling toward him with outstretched hands. "You fight as though you are alone," the warp murmured. "And yet, even you know solitude cannot conquer eternity." The mirrored sky cracked, shards falling around him like crystal rain. Each shard reflected the moment he had seen the Emperor, an afterimage of divine pressure and unbearable presence. The warp coiled around that memory like a jealous serpent. "You touched him," the voice hissed. "You survived his gaze. No mortal mind should endure such weight." The dunes cracked open, revealing the molten glow of pure warp stuff beneath. "You are not mortal. The illusion shattered. Sasuke stood once again in the sanctum, hands still touching the barrier. But something had changed. Halbrecht saw it immediately, stiffened, raised his blade, and took a step back. Sasuke's chakra burned with new resonance. The air trembled around him. The Rinnegan rings spun faster, reacting to forces neither the Imperium nor the shinobi world were meant to understand. He could feel it. A thread linking him to the warp, another linking him to the material realm. And between them, a point of tension only he could sense. "Sasuke," Halbrecht said slowly, "what happened?" The ship lurched again, dragged closer to the eye. Lightning arced across the sanctum ceiling. A vox shrieked warnings of catastrophic collapse. Sasuke did not answer him. He stepped forward and pressed both hands to the barrier. Chakra surged. The warp answered instantly. Reality buckled. The ship screeched as if flayed alive. "Sasuke, stop!" Halbrecht roared. "You cannot master the warp. It will consume you." Sasuke pushed harder. His chakra clashed with the warp's pull in a torrent of violent force. Energy spiraled outward in rings that dented bulkheads and sent acolytes flying. The storm outside shifted. The ship slowed. For a moment, it worked. And then the warp screamed. A psychic backlash hit Sasuke like a hammer of raw chaos. His vision blurred. Blood flooded from his eyes. His limbs trembled as if someone were peeling his chakra apart, strand by strand. The warp roared through his mind. "You dare try to master us. You dare try to bend destiny." Images flashed. His brother's final words. Naruto's desperate hand reaching for him. His old self, eyes filled with rage. His future self, shrouded in lightning and shadow. Sasuke gasped. His mind cracked, just for a moment, under infinite pressure. The ship lurched backward violently, thrown clear of the eye for a breath of relief. Then the backlash hit him fully. He collapsed to the floor, body shaking uncontrollably, as reality reasserted itself with brutal force. Halbrecht knelt beside him, gripping his armor with both hands. "Sasuke Uchiha, listen to me. You cannot master the warp. You cannot touch it without paying a price. Do you understand?" Sasuke forced his eyes open. The Rinnegan's rings barely held their shape. "I understand," he whispered. His voice trembled, not with fear, with the knowledge of what he had touched, what he had become, and the terrible truth that waited beyond it. The warp was not done with him. The deck still trembled beneath Sasuke as he forced himself upright, palms sliding against the cold metal, breath thin and uneven. The sanctum flickered with half-dead lumens, their stuttering glow casting long shadows across the wreckage. Every heartbeat echoed strangely inside him, as though some deeper rhythm, something ancient, something vast, had grafted itself into his pulse. His vision steadied slowly, though the Rinnegan's rings quivered with residual instability, each pulse a reminder of the impossible pressure he had endured. Halbrecht hovered near him, torn between caution and necessity. Smoke curled from cracked armor plates, the Inquisitor's stance wavering from wounds he stubbornly refused to acknowledge. "You pushed beyond the limit of mortals," he said, voice low, "and nearly tore yourself apart." Sasuke met his gaze with a calm that felt eerily detached, as if part of him had not yet fully returned from the warp. "I held the ship away from the eye. You delayed its death," Halbrecht corrected, "not stopped it." The ship groaned again, hull plating buckling as gravitational tides clawed at its wounded frame. Sparks cascaded from overhead vents. A distant explosion rattled the sanctum, followed by a psychic shriek as another containment chamber ruptured. Chaos had not relented. Every corridor still crawled with cultists, demons, and the remnants of corrupted marines. The black ship was a battlefield suspended between salvation and oblivion. Sasuke steadied his stance. His chakra swirled, uneven and bruised, yet gathering strength. I can do more. Halbrecht stiffened. You can do too much. That is the danger. He stepped closer, lowering his blade. You have no idea what you touched in there. No psyker has ever endured a direct brush with the Emperor's presence. You should be dead. Sasuke exhaled slowly. The memory of that radiant force, immense, crushing, absolute, still lingered in the marrow of his bones. But I'm not. No, Halbrecht murmured bitterly. You are something far worse. Before Sasuke could answer, the sanctum's viewing barrier flared with sudden brilliance. Warp lightning split across the void outside in spiraling torrents, each bolt wider than mountains. The eye of terror convulsed like a living wound. Tendrils of unreality clawed outward, cracking against the ship's failing defenses. The Gellerfield collapsed fully with a shriek of ruptured energy. The warp surged inward. Walls dripped like melting wax. Shadows stretched into impossible shapes. The air filled with whispers, laughter, and the rustle of wings that belonged to no living creature. Tech priests convulsed as psychic backlash ripped through their augmetics. Acolytes clutched their heads and screamed as unseen claws scraped at their minds. Halbrecht drew himself to full height, raising his blade in defiance. The final breach, he rasped. They mean to consume us. Sasuke stepped in front of him. The warp met him first. It rushed into the sanctum like a tide of living night, coiling around Sasuke with hungry fervor. Colors broke apart, space bent. The air sizzled as swirling patterns of prophecy and paradox formed around him, visible to all psychers still conscious. His presence drew the warp in, shaped it, distorted it, not through will, but through something deeper. The attention was no longer subtle. It was absolute. A voice cut through the storm, not soft, not amused, commanding. Come, Uchiha. Sasuke's breath caught. His vision blurred again into the half-realm between thought and nightmare. A shadow formed, shifting feathers, burning sigils, 1,000 blinking eyes woven into a shape that could not fully exist in any sane universe. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate. For the first time, the presence spoke loudly enough to rupture the sanctum's remaining wards. Halbrecht staggered, blood spraying from his nose as he fell to one knee. Others simply collapsed, their minds wilting under the psychic weight. You have touched the warp, and you did not break. You saw the Emperor, and you did not bow. The shadow blurred nearer, its form bending around Sasuke like a crown of living colors. Destiny bends to you. Sasuke raised his head slowly. I bend to no one. The warp shuddered with a sound like laughter and thunder merging. You misunderstand. We do not seek dominance over you. We seek direction, creation, change. The shadow pulsed, warping the very air. Become ours, and you will remake the stars. Become ours, and the warp will kneel. Become ours, and the gods will learn fear. Halbrecht forced himself upright, voice breaking. Do not listen. It is manipulating you. It will consume you. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. The offers of power, destiny, cosmic dominion. He had heard them before, from Orochimaru, from Obito, from Kaguya, from every force that tried to twist him into a weapon. The warp was simply the largest version of the same temptation. He stepped forward, not toward the shadow, but through it. The warp flinched. The shadow dissolved. Tzeentch's voice rippled like broken glass. You refuse? You would reject infinity? Sasuke's chakra surged. lightning crackling across his limbs. "I didn't come here to serve gods," he said, voice low and steady. "I came here to find my own path." The warp reared back like a wounded beast. The sanctum shuddered. The eye flashed with violent brilliance. The tendrils of unreality clawing at the ship tore loose, recoiling as though burned. For a heartbeat, just one, the warp hesitated, not defeated, not repelled, confused, and, in that moment of hesitation, Halbrecht shouted, "All power to the thrusters! Break free now!" Engines ignited with a roar that shook the stars. The ship lurched violently, tearing itself from the warp's grasp, with the desperate force of a drowning creature gasping for air. The sanctum shook. Panels exploded. The viewing barrier shattered outward into space. Starlight flooded the room. Real starlight. The black ship drifted clear of the eye's outer tendrils, engines burning, hull buckling, but intact. Alarm softened. The warp's whispers faded from the air. Sasuke stood at the shattered edge of the sanctum, breathing hard, eyes dimming as the last traces of warp contact receded. Halbrecht approached him slowly. "You challenged the warp," the Inquisitor said quietly, "and it yielded." Sasuke didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the distant stars, the first stable light he had seen since entering this cursed universe. "I wasn't trying to defeat it," he murmured, "only to choose." He closed his eyes. The warp was silent, for now, but he felt it watching, waiting, endlessly patient. The storm he had denied would return, and when it did, Sasuke Uchiha would not run from it. He would meet it again, as the shinobi who dared to defy eternity,